When I was younger, each summer and almost every New Year, my family would pack the car and go on a road trip to visit family in Mexico. We never had any problems until one particular trip when I was 8. Like every road trip before, we left our home in North Texas around 6 p.m. in order to reach our destination the next morning. So around 2 a.m. we crossed into Mexico, and that's when things got weird. When you're on the only stretch of freeway in the middle of the desert, you don't tend to freak out about having the same car behind you for miles. It was practically pitch black outside our car windows, the only visible shapes being the dotted stars and the eerie silhouettes of the cacti. We'd been in Mexico for about an hour and still had few more to drive, and I remember sleeping but still being semi-conscious of what was around me because I didn't have the skill to really fall asleep in a car. So when my mother suddenly spoke my dad's name, I heard her. "Miguel, that car behind us. It's been behind us since we left Laredo." My dad peeked at the car, shrugged off my mother's tension. "A lot of cars use this road. He's probably going to Reynosa or another city." And he left it at that. Despite his sureness, my mom kept a wary eye on the car behind us. By this time, my siblings and I were hyper-aware of the car and entertained ourselves with watching the car through the gaps in the luggage that blocked the rear window. We got tired pretty quick. "He's getting closer," my mother noted, and we turned to watch as the car inched closer and closer to ours. "He's too close, Miguel." And she was right. By this time, the car was practically pressed against the rear of our car, and on a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere with another few hours until daylight, it was downright scary. We couldn't do much. My dad didn't slow down, didn't stop, and he didn't speed away either. He just drove, and the car followed. The next 30 minutes were the most tense we had ever experienced. The car would ease off sometimes only to press its blinding headlights against our rear once more, like he knew he was freaking us out and enjoying it. It was during one of the periods that the car had pulled away that my mom spotted a police car up ahead parked on the side of the road, and she didn't miss a beat. "Pull over!" Right in front of the police. "Pull over right now, Miguel." And he did. And the car kept driving. I wonder how confused the policeman must have been as he watched my dad park our car right in front of him. The policeman came over and asked what was wrong, and my mother urgently told him everything. The car, the way it followed us and taunted us. The policeman took her claims seriously and told us of how people were victimized and had their cars stolen on these empty highways by thugs and criminals. And then he offered to drive behind us for a while to make us feel safe. We drove off with the police cruiser behind us, relieved. Until about 10 minutes later when we saw something that confirmed the policeman's words and my mother's worst fears. 10 minutes later, we saw the car pulled over on the side of the road, waiting. The heavy rain had turned the asphalt into a slick, reflective surface. Raindrops pounded against the windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. Jake gripped the steering wheel tightly while Emily, sitting in the passenger seat, glanced at the GPS. They had been driving for hours, and this grim night was turning what was supposed to be a fun road trip into something unsettling. His eyelids were growing heavy, but the endless road markings rolling past kept him focused. Suddenly, they saw a dark figure standing by the side of the road. A man in a heavy coat, his hood pulled up, hugged himself against the cold. Jake slowed down. "Maybe we shouldn't," Emily said hesitantly. But Jake sighed. "We can't just leave someone out here in this weather," he replied. The man's face was obscured by the rain and darkness, but he looked miserable. Jake brought the car to a stop and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" Jake asked. The man lifted his head, his eyes squinting against the rain. His voice was unsteady, whether from the cold or something else. "Just to town, if that's okay." Emily shifted uncomfortably, but Jake unlocked the door. The man silently slid into the back seat, his soaked clothes releasing a damp, musty scent. "Thank you," he murmured. Silence settled over the car as they continued down the road. Aside from the rain, the tires on wet pavement, and the rhythmic swiping of the wipers, there was no sound. Jake tried to start a conversation. "Rough night to be out. Where are you coming from?" The man hesitated for a moment. "Doesn't matter," he finally replied. Emily, watching him through the rearview mirror, noticed his hands resting on his knees, fingers clenched so tightly they looked like they might break. As the miles passed, Emily's unease grew. The man barely moved, his face still partially hidden by the hood. She leaned toward Jake and whispered, "I don't know. Something feels off." Before Jake could respond, the hitchhiker suddenly spoke. "How much farther?" His voice sent a chill through Emily. Jake glanced at the GPS. "About 20 miles. There's a gas station up ahead. We can drop you off there if you'd like." The man slowly shook his head. "No," he said, his voice firm. "You can't drop me off there." His tone sent a wave of anxiety through Emily. The air inside the car felt heavier. Jake caught a glimpse of the man in the rearview mirror. His hood still shadowed most of his face, but there was a faint, almost amused smile playing at the corner of his lips. A few moments later, Emily rummaged through her bag and noticed something on the floor near the man's feet. A damp, crumpled newspaper. Curious, she picked it up and scanned the headline. Her blood ran cold. "Escaped convict still at large," and beneath it, a familiar face. The man sitting right behind them. Emily's hand tightened around Jake's arm. He glanced at the newspaper, and his breath caught in his throat. Panic surged through him, but he knew they had to stay calm. Taking a deep breath, he gripped the wheel tighter and spoke as casually as he could. "I think we need to stop for gas." The hitchhiker didn't respond immediately, but his eyes narrowed slightly. The glow of the gas station lights appeared in the distance. Jake kept driving at a normal pace, though his heart was pounding. Emily clutched her phone tightly. As they approached the station, Jake suddenly slammed the brakes and shouted, "Emily, now!" She flung the door open and tumbled out, while Jake left the engine running and bolted toward the station. The man didn't move right away. Those few seconds made all the difference. By the time Jake and Emily reached the safety of the station's bright lights, they turned to look back. The man was still sitting in the car. For a moment, he was completely still. Then he slowly opened the door and melted into the darkness, vanishing into the rain. A station attendant stepped outside. "Hey, are you two okay?" Emily, shivering, managed to whisper, "Call the police." She held up the newspaper and the color drained from the attendant's face. "That guy? Years ago, he stopped a car just like yours and killed everyone inside." Joe and Laura were excited as they hopped into the car for their long-awaited road trip. They had planned a scenic drive along the West Coast. Laura had the GPS open on her phone, guiding the way, while Joe tapped his fingers on the steering wheel to the rhythm of the music. As the sun began to set, the roads became more deserted, and the city lights faded into the distance. "We need to take a right here," Laura said, looking at the screen. But Joe noticed something strange. The road signs didn't match the map. "This is weird. There should have been a highway exit here," he muttered. The GPS signal flickered and then disappeared completely. The screen now read, "No signal." Laura glanced out the window. The road was narrowing, and dense trees surrounded them on both sides. "Should we turn back?" Laura asked nervously. Joe shrugged. "Let's keep going for a bit. The road should widen again." But it didn't. Instead, it turned into a winding, uneven path, splitting into smaller, unfamiliar trails. Turning around wasn't easy either. The edges of the road were muddy and unstable. As darkness fell, Laura felt a growing unease. "Who even uses this road? It doesn't feel like a highway," she whispered. Joe slowed the car down, the headlights cutting through the thick trees ahead. Other than the low hum of the engine, there was complete silence. A light drizzle began to fall, making the atmosphere even more unsettling. A few minutes later, a rundown gas station appeared by the side of the road. Joe steered toward it, hoping to find someone who could help. But the building was shrouded in darkness. Not a single light was on. Laura's stomach twisted with anxiety. "I don't think anyone's here," she whispered. Joe stayed inside the car and honked the horn. No response. Just then, Laura's eyes locked onto one of the shattered windows of the station. Her breath caught in her throat and she whispered, "Joe, there's someone there." Joe turned to look, but the window was empty. "Are you sure?" he asked cautiously. Laura's pulse raced. "I saw them. They were watching us." Joe shifted into reverse, ready to speed away, but the engine suddenly died. The car wouldn't start. Laura's breath quickened. Joe turned the key again, but all he heard was a faint clicking sound. "No, no, no," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel. Laura frantically checked her phone, still no signal. Then footsteps, faint but deliberate, just outside the car. Joe's grip tightened on Laura's arm. "Don't move," he whispered. They both held their breath, staring into the darkness. A soft clicking noise came from behind the car. Someone, or something, was there. Laura felt tears welling up, her body frozen in fear. In a desperate move, Joe released the handbrake and tried the ignition one more time. The engine coughed and then roared to life. Without hesitation, Joe slammed the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward. Laura risked one last glance behind them. In the dim glow of the headlights, she saw something. Shadowy figures shifting near the gas station, retreating into the darkness. A mile down the road, the GPS signal suddenly returned. The map showed that they had been driving on a road that shouldn't have existed. "There's not even supposed to be a road here," Laura said, her voice still shaky. Joe's hands were clenched tightly around the steering wheel. "We're never taking shortcuts again," he muttered. Then, from the back seat, there was a faint clicking noise. Laura's eyes widened in terror. Joe glanced into the rearview mirror. As the car sped through the darkness, they could no longer be sure if they were truly alone.